like to introduce someone to you that came all the way from Blacksburg, Virginia. He hails from Virginia Tech, and I certainly hope if there's one thing that we get out of this presentation, we figure out what the heck a Hokie is. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Blank. Dr. Blank is the department head and professor of agriculture and applied economics at Virginia Tech. Dr. Blank received his PhD and Master's of Science in Agricultural Economics from the University of Hawaii, his MBA from the University of Massachusetts, and his Bachelor of Arts in Business Administration from California State University, Stanislaus. Dr. Blank is going to speak to us today about the agricultural market outlook in a global context. Dr. Blank, welcome.
Well, as you just heard, I'm from Virginia Tech. I've only been there, though, since about March. I came to Virginia Tech after 24 years at the University of California at Davis, and especially in that position, I've been asked often to try to explain what in the heck is going on in agricultural markets. And so I'm going to try to give you very much a big global perspective. I am going to give some indications as to where the markets are going, but I think more importantly, what most people that are not economists wonder about is how the forecast that you hear from an economist, where does it come from? What kind of factors are influencing it? And so that's one of the things that I'm going to try to do today and you see in the title, I'm going to try to do this in a global context, because today they're literally, for reasons I'll explain in about two slides, all of our commodity markets truly are global. Even if you think you are operating in a local market, you aren't. The world has changed literally in the last generation. And in particular, I'm going to talk about some significant changes that have occurred in the last decade. From an agricultural economics perspective, and if you look, and I'm looking primarily at farm and ranch level, but of course the implications for the entire agribusiness sector are significant. Literally, the whole world has changed in the last decade. And that's why the story, the last decade, has been hard to explain, because some of these factors didn't make themselves quite so clear as they are now. In particular, 10 years ago, when I was giving a very similar talk at places all over the country and in several other countries, it was very hard to explain, because 10 years ago, all of the indicators pointed in a different direction. So, what is going on? Well, an economist, whoops, let me go back. Sensitive button. What is going on? Well, as an economist, you always look at both sides of the economic price determining market situation. There's the supply side, and then there's the demand side. And the story up until 10 years ago was almost all about supply. In fact, our ability to produce was the story until about 10 years ago, and then for reasons I'll explain, the world literally changed because of demand factors. So let me back up and sort of give you the story in very global terms, since I've only got about 45 minutes to explain what obviously has taken about a century to develop. First of all, technology in all of its different forms has been the catalyst for almost everything that has happened in the last 200 years. Literally since the first machines were applied to agricultural production and harvesting, production, and in particular the technology related to production, were the story. And so it was advances in production first that occurred. Our ability to try to improve output so that we could feed people, first of all, feed them, period. A couple hundred years ago, that was the question. And of course, now in the last century, feed them better and feed them with more variety and a healthier diet. And so all of the technological advances in agribusiness firms such as this one and in universities like the land-grant system that I've worked in my career have been focusing on what can we do to expand output. And what happens in an economic sense is when you're successful, when you've been able to expand output, raise yields and so on, here's generally, in very simplest terms, what happens. An individual producer, literally one farmer, one rancher, they sell, when they harvest their output, whether that's poultry, pork, corn, wheat, you name it, whatever it is, when they harvest it, the cheapest thing to do is to sell it to the closest customers. So if your neighbors will buy everything you've produced, that's where you do, that's what you do. But gradually, as your output expands, literally, your neighbor will buy all that he wants, and when he's satisfied, then you go to the next one and the next one. But what essentially happens is, as your output, your surplus beyond what you're going to eat yourself, grows, you have to go physically farther away from the point of production to find enough customers to buy all of your output. And so what happens is, and has happened last century, is that our ability to produce, and I say our, not only the United States, but the world in general, but the United States clearly as the world leader, we have now literally created the need for global markets because we produce so much now. Virtually every product produced in this country is in a surplus relative to domestic consumption. So we need to literally not only go to our next door neighbors, but over oceans and so on to find enough customers to buy all of the output we're producing. Well, that need for global market created needs for two other areas of technological innovation. First of all, storage. Because as you all know, as soon as you harvest something that was living, you know, like a fruit, vegetable, grain, whatever it is, the instant it's harvested, it's no longer growing, it's no longer alive, it's deteriorating. And so storage is, in a sense, the science of slowing the amount of time between harvest and spoilage to give you more time to cover that extra distance you have to go to find all your customers. And then, of course, the transportation system needs to be able to get you to cover that distance, to have the capacity to physically transport the product and do it in a cost-effective way. And so these three different areas of technological innovation have literally transformed the world, and in particular since about 1970s. Those of us old enough to remember the oil embargo of 1973 probably have noticed that since then the global economic picture has been completely different. You know, cost of that one input alone, oil, changed the economics of a lot of commodity markets. So now the situation that we have is production is not the problem. In fact, we literally, right now, at this point in time, the global food production system with existing technology is able to provide 2,500 calories a day for every person that is and is expected to be alive over the next century with no changes whatsoever. We've got the capacity to feed people. Now, of course, it's a problem of economic distribution, the ability to buy the food that is the problem, not to produce it. All right. So globalization of markets has been the story of the last century. The 21st century is going to be a different story. But the 20th century was all about globalization of markets. That technological expansion going, through the 1900s was astonishing. But one of the things that I'm going to show you some slides, some graphs here in a minute, was that globalization of the market in particular affects the profitability of those markets. Because, well, I'll show you in a second here. So as the profitability changes, as you might guess, if you're producing more and more and more and you have surpluses, the profitability is getting lowered on a per unit basis. That profitability change affects the composition of markets. In other words, who are your competitors in whatever markets you're in? Well, profitability, I said, was the first issue. just to give you some numbers to kind of show you where we've been recently. In this last 30-year period, well, about 35 years now, from the mid-70s, like I said, the oil embargo of 73 really was not the factor, but one of the big factors that changed agricultural markets. And in particular, since then, over that 30-year period, the average profit margin at the farm and ranch level, in other words, for American agriculture as a whole, was 2 to 3%. That's, and as many of you probably know, that means that there's a lot of people who were in the negatives. In fact, I can tell you to this day, 2/3 of all American farmers and ranchers lose money every year. It's only the top end that actually is a profitable, viable business in a standalone sense. Now, as I was gathering some of these numbers up until about 2005, this was a rather scary story, and we were trying to figure out, wait a minute, if things are that bad, how are people surviving? Here is the quickest part of the answer. Right now, and it's been true for decades, but right now, 90% of all American farmers and ranchers have income from off-farm sources, meaning that farmers and ranchers, being the bright people they are, figured out, if I can't make enough money producing agricultural commodities, maybe I need to diversify my household's portfolio into other markets. And essentially what we all know has happened, especially if you've traveled or lived in the part of the world in the central part of our country, usually it's one of the spouses does the agricultural production and the other one goes to town and gets a real job. What kind of jobs? Well, the most typical, as you might guess, are wives going into town and being, in particular, nurses or teachers. And what's really interesting, if you look at sort of the nature of how that's influenced our whole culture, is in the Midwestern part of the country where population is declining in many counties throughout the Midwest, from Montana to Texas, most of the school district superintendents and whatnot are wives and sometimes husbands of farm operators because they're stable. They get a job as a beginning teacher, spend their whole life in the same district, rise up through the ranks, and they wind up running the thing. So this economic evolution has all kinds of sociological and other implications. But from the picture I'm trying to paint here, the key message is that literally we as agriculturists had to adapt to this profitability pressure, this very low margin that we're seeing here. One of the ways that farmers have adapted is, and you're going to hear me use the term portfolio a lot, because as I started doing back in the 90s, I found it's very easy to explain what's going on in most businesses of the world, including agricultural businesses, if you understand the terminology and the simple logic behind investments, where you spread your money out into different products or crops, and in the case of agricultural producers, to spread your risk, because individually commodity markets are very volatile, which means very risky. And so what has happened is, and this has been not a recent phenomenon, but a continuous phenomenon for a century, is that as American agriculture has spread out over the country and then specialized based on what the microclimates make possible, which means in the middle of the country it's wheat, corn, soybeans, hogs, and cattle essentially. And then in the coasts, the east and west coast, where the climate is a little more pleasant, we can produce a lot of different crops, and so people often are in multiple crops. I can tell you, I came from California, a few months ago. There they produce over 300 different commodities in California, and we've done surveys galore, and only cattle and rice producers are not diversified. Everybody else produces 5, 10, sometimes over 30 different commodities, depending on the scale of your operation. And this is across livestock, crops, and then value-added products, and so on. So, in response to the additional sort of profit pressures going on in agriculture, I've sort of coined the term of this farming food chain, meaning, and I'll show you the slide in just a second, that the nature of people's portfolios of agricultural enterprises is changing. And they're changing in such a way that on average, they're actually becoming more risky. Now, I'll explain that with my next slide, because you think, wait a minute, if somebody's under pressure from profitability and they're in very risky markets, maybe they want to reduce risk. Well, they are. Individually, producers are reducing their risk by diversifying. But as a whole, as a country, the crops we produce now, our current national portfolio, is more risky than the one that was going on 10 and 20 and 30 and 100 years ago. It also, our current portfolio requires more money per acre. In other words, what you're growing, the technology that's required to produce whatever that crop might be, now requires more investment per acre. Now, what do I mean by this? This is the farming food chain. And notice this big arrow here points that essentially what is happening is that land or resources are moving from the lowest level to the higher levels of economic development and profitability. Just like in the stock market, where you always hear there's a risk and return are positively related, meaning the more risk you take on, the chances are you may generate more return, or the reverse, if you want more return, you have to take on more risk. The same is true in agriculture. One of the first projects I did at University of California back in the late 80s, when I got there, was we had about 3 decades worth of data on every commodity grown in every one of the 58 counties for 30 years. And so we literally went through and did a profitability analysis by crop, by county, put all that data together, and sure enough, what we anticipated was occurring. And that was that gradually a bigger share of acreage was moving out of the low value, low price crops, which we lumped into, and we were able to, by looking at where they were, we found these categories, these types. Low value annual crops, like grains. They generate the lowest amount of revenue and net profit per acre compared to all the alternatives. Low value perennials, like forages, like hay and whatnot, are better. High value annual crops, like fruits and vegetables, generate more money. And the highest value or high value perennials, like tree and vine crops. And one of the things we also noticed was this column over here, that as you follow the arrow, the crops that generated the lowest revenue and profit per acre also required the lowest investment, and the asset fixity, or in other words, the assets you were using to produce that crop, were very flexible, meaning they could be used to produce alternate crops. But as you move up, the level of investment per acre goes up, and the fixity, or the inability to shift the use of the hardware from one product to another, gets increasingly limited, which means that as you're moving up this farming food chain, when you choose to produce any of these higher level crops, you really do need to have very specialized investment, both in terms of human skills and also hardware. So what does that mean? Well, for example, in California, the amount of acreage in the highest level perennials, tree and vine crops, is going up and up and up, and I'll show you the slide in a second. But what are the economic impacts? Well, let me give you some numbers to put this into scale. Over that 30-year period, from the 50s through the 80s, and I've updated, and the same thing has been true in the last quarter century, these crops, like let's say grain crops, which we really don't grow much grain in California, it's more of a rotational crop with vegetables. But anyway, how much do you make on some of these? Well, a couple $100 an acre. I mean, between $50 and $200 an acre growing wheat. That's that's a lost leader, basically. Because what happens if you move up to here? The highest valued crops, of course, we all know people love to grow grapes in California, but it's actually plums and almonds and some of these other tree crops that make the most money. One of those, I think the highest one, was in fact plums at the time of the study, and their net profit per acre, this is, you know, before taxes, but after all expenses, was over $5,000 an acre. But over that 30-year period, we observed, and this is county averages, not individual, but county averages, we found that high value crop had some years where they would make $20,000 an acre. Other years they'd lose $30,000 an acre. So you had to have very deep pockets to be in some of these crops. Hence, people usually don't go from here to there quickly. They'll kind of gradually migrate, put more and more of their resources in this direction. In fact, I also, before I was at Davis, I was at University of Arizona, and I remember working with some lettuce growers along the Colorado River at that time. This was in the mid-'80s. And I remember this one very large-scale grower that's geographically diversified, which meant they had farms in Mexico all the way up to the border, into Arizona, into California, and then on up north, so they could harvest almost every month of the year. They'd start at the bottom and work their way up and then start over. And I asked them about their operation, and they said, yeah, we only make money about 2 years out of 5 on average. And I'm thinking, oh my God. And about that point, he started smiling. He says, yeah, but those 2 years can be real nice. Well, that took a whole different mindset than I was used to. But just as an indicator of this trend, those tree and vine crops and those high-value annual crops need to be irrigated. Certainly in the western part of the country where water is scarce, if you don't have irrigation, you don't grow any of those crops. But even in the east, to control the production process, many, not all, but many of our tree and vine and fruit and vegetable crops in the east also need to be irrigated. So this graph, which shows the percentage of total cropland that is irrigated, is a good indicator of this shift. Now, it's hard to see back here, so I'll explain. Over here on this end, the first data point, all of this data on this chart comes from the U.S. agricultural census. About every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture does a census. Just like every 10 years we do one for population, well, every 5 years or so we do one with agriculture. And here's literally the years they were done. And see, it wasn't always 5 years. And the last one that we've done was 2007, which means one's going on right now. But they haven't obviously completed it. But what this graph shows is since 1949, there was about 5% of American cropland was irrigated. Which, as you probably can guess, then that means fruit and vegetables were a very small part of our portfolio. We grew a whole bunch of, you know, wheat and corn and so on in the Midwest. But over time, and you see from 49 to 2007, it's almost a perfectly straight line of expansion. And the reason I'm pointing out and sort of highlighting fruits and vegetable crops is, and this is sort of one of the punchlines I'm giving you, is that we've discovered that because, let me go back, if we focus on these top two categories, that they really are very much the tip of the spear in the sense of showing what is going on in terms of the health of the production sector of American agriculture. When fruit and vegetables are growing, that means the economy is doing well. And then, of course, the reverse. All right, well, up to that point, I was talking supply side. Things going on affecting the supply of agricultural commodities. Now it's time to start talking about demand and what has happened. And the best way to illustrate that is, I'm going to show you several slides, and because the scale is very hard to see, I'm just going to point out the big picture, because you don't need to know the details, but this is, as you can see by the slide, this is a chart of commodity prices. So if you notice right over here, this indicator. It's not just food crops. There's some other other than agricultural commodities included. But it's important. I wanted to start by talking about commodity prices, which includes metals, oil, a few others. This chart right over here starts in 1980. So right here, this is 1980. And then it works its way over to here, 2008. So about 3 decades. Now, these are price indexes, meaning they've taken the prices and they've lumped them together and so on. And see if I can find, there it is, right up in the top. Right there is the index. So in 2002, which is, whoops, sorry, my fingers are too fat for this. Let's see. Right there, there's a dashed line at 2002. Remember I said 2002, the world changed? It's hard to see because of the scale, but as that indicates right there, the index at what prices were in 2002, right there, is 100, an index of 100. And so if that's 100, you can see this is significantly higher than 100 30 years ago. And so this chart, first of all, shows that over the last 30 years, and I'm focusing on the red line, which you can see is food commodities. If you look at the red line, it bounces around, but essentially, if we were to plot this on a trend line, it slopes down, meaning that for these 30 years, and if I went back to 1910, it would be the same. Since right before World War I, a century ago, the actual nominal prices for commodities have been almost flat. And lately, last 30 years, they've been going down, which is a function of that surplus I kept talking about, the supply side. But notice in 2002, all these lines suddenly rocket straight up. Something changed, and it was the demand side. And notice I'm saying demand, not consumption. Consumption, or a consumer, is somebody that literally consumes a product, that uses it in the way that it's intended to be used. Like if it's food, you eat it. Demand is something different. It's somebody that wants to buy the product, but not necessarily consume it. Now I'm going to show you essentially the same information. Now my graph is about 10 years older. So this now is 1970. And way over there is still 2008. But I went back an extra decade because I wanted to make sure I got the 70s in. Here's 70, 75, 80. Because it was during the 70s that we first saw some of these weird blips in the market. Now what the red line on this chart is just, it's an index. You can see it's an average price of 4 crops, wheat, soybeans, corn, rice, and it's the same index with right there, 2002 being 100, and here's 100. So you can clearly see, clear back in the 70s, the nominal, which means the actual dollar amount that you handed over per unit of a commodity, were actually higher almost 40 years ago. And once again, those of us with, let's just say, long memories, in the 1970s, there was a lot of strange things occurring in the grain markets in particular, where the U.S. had huge surpluses of grain. We sold a bunch of it to Russia and other things and so on. So prices really did go in the 70s from relatively what was normal at that point to unprecedented high levels in that decade. And then in nominal terms, you look, this is almost a straight line if you kind of even out all those ups and downs. But all of a sudden, boom. And if you look at the red line here, it's over 300. So prices in a 6-year period more than tripled. But it's even more dramatic if you look at prices adjusted for purchasing power, which means what economists call real terms. And that's this blue line. Basically, with the index meaning they took whatever a dollar was valued at in 2002 and then worked our way back to adjust for inflation, to take that effect out. And what this shows is, here's 100, that back in the 70s, in terms of purchasing power, these four commodities were 6 times, almost 7 times, as valued as they were in 2002. So once again showing, once you adjust for all the economic factors like inflation, commodity prices, of course in the 70s it was a very weird blip, but then there was this continuous downturn all the way to there. Yeah, there were these 2 and 3 year cycles, but essentially that is clearly a downtrend having to do with the surplus issue. Once again, it took off. What happened? Okay, well, one more number just to kind of show you, because this one obviously will be of interest to you. And I'm focusing on crop markets because there's more of them, and frankly, the economics of crop markets are easier to explain. Livestock markets actually are less volatile, believe it or not. I know some of you will wonder about me saying that. But in livestock markets, they're less volatile because they more directly relate to the economic well-being of consumers. And let me show you this number. This is global meat. So global meat is basically beef, pork, and poultry. So they've put it together, created an index, and this graph from 1970 to I think it's 2007, I think, the USDA put this number together. They've shown 2 numbers. This black line is per capita consumption. In other words, the average amount of product consumed per person. Now this is globally, not just the US. The fact that consumption is going up from the 100 index to about 175. In other words, what is that, 75% increase in about 35 years is astonishingly good. It shows that globally, quality of life in terms of the ability to acquire and consume food is going up. Now, what do I mean, consume food? Well, in particular, what we see is in the poorest parts of the world, the cheapest food tends to be locally grown crops. And as people's income improves, they choose to spend more of their money improving their diet by raising protein content from meat mostly. And so the fact that this line is going up means globally people, and of course this is on average, are getting better off and they're investing more of their money in meat products. Very good news. This green line shows the various meat industries' average production. And notice that it's going up too. Now it's going up faster. Now that would seem to be a bit of a contradiction. Wait a minute, how can production go up faster? Well, remember, these are in percentage terms. But notice this box here, that the rate of increase, even though both of those lines are almost straight lines in terms of sort of numbers, the rate of increase is declining. This column right here shows from 75 to 90, both consumption and production were going up at these percentage rates per, average per year. They're still going up, 90 through 07, but not quite as fast in a percentage basis. They're going up pretty steadily in absolute terms, which tells an economist that means it's a direct function of first population and then essentially population's income per capita. So it's a function of shifting diets coming from shifting economic circumstances. Okay, so in other words, demand is getting better, but it's not just the number of people and the number of dollars they have to spend. There's a whole bunch of weird things going, because that other graph I just showed you was from 1970, and there were nice straight lines. But a couple graphs earlier, I showed you these lines that went down to 02 and then suddenly rocketed up. What has happened about 10 years ago? Here I start to give you some of the least disputed factors influencing. Not an exhaustive list. Once again, I've got some factors that are clearly having strong amounts of impact and some that are having weak. Now notice the weak include the usual suspects. Well, you know, the weather, we certainly know this last year, weather has been a big story. But in terms of the overall picture, weather effects and their impact on production, and certainly on demand, tend to be rather weak when you kind of put them in a relative sense. International trade, the fact that the US dollar has been, by policy, kept low so that we facilitate more international trade by making our products relatively cheaper for other people to buy, and conversely, other countries' products more expensive for us to buy, hence trying to reduce demand for Chinese products. And even energy prices. These actually are relatively minor parts of the story. The big ones are new suspects, not usually in the lineup. To start at the top, and once again, I'm just giving you some of the ones that every economist will agree are a suspect, not necessarily the extent. But in particular, policy change. In academia, we routinely try to keep tabs on what's going on in the industry by surveying farmers and agribusiness managers, trying to ask, you know, what's going on in your market. And for my entire career, every time I've ever surveyed growers, and this includes not just California, Virginia, I spent a year in South Dakota, some time in Arizona. In fact, I even spent a couple of years in Australia. It's the same, and that is farmers said, you know, policy, government policy related to food and fiber markets and so on, and production used to be a source of certainty, and now they're a source of uncertainty, meaning that they can come out of nowhere, change markets, and sometimes disappear. And some of the coming out of nowhere, here's a good example that's getting lots of attention. The ethanol policy change of about 2005. For all kinds of reasons, and I'll give you the shortest version, in the mid part of the last decade, the Midwest, in particular corn growers, were not doing especially well. Their prices were still low. I know this is only 7 years ago, but if you can imagine, corn prices were still down in the $2 to $3 a bushel range. But their costs had gone up. Now, that profit squeeze was making a whole very large section in a very centralized part of the country very unhappy. And so policymakers representing that constituency group said, well, you know, if we just tell the whole country that we have to include ethanol in all the gasoline we buy, that suddenly adds a whole new demand for corn. If you just say, we must put corn into gas, instantly there was a new chunk of demand that didn't exist the day before. That has triggered this, this ethanol program has triggered a couple of things. For example, right now, does anybody know what the price of corn is? $7 to $10 is the range I've heard. That's about right. In other words, double to triple what it was 7 years ago. Now, can anybody guess what corn prices would be if the backlash to the ethanol program results in the ethanol program being pulled, like a lot of people are arguing it should? Probably down to $3 again, right? Soybeans. Soybeans, in a production sense, is an alternative to corn. If you've got dirt and climate that can grow corn, you're in the Midwest, you probably also could grow soybeans, and because of the seasons being slightly different, with soybeans coming a little bit later, soybeans are feeling the effects of this effect on the corn market. Anybody know what soybean prices are right now? I've heard 18. Do I hear 20? That's next week. Does anybody remember what soybean prices were 7 or 8 years ago? 5 or 6. So it doesn't have to be just, you're not just ethanol producers that are affected by the ethanol policy, corn producers, and of course alternative crops like soybeans and so on. And I'm sure most of you in this particular company know livestock producers that don't grow any of those crops are feeling the effects in a significant way because that's their feed. In particular, I grew up on a cattle ranch in California, and I can tell you a lot of cattlemen in the West, they're really loving the extremely high prices, the record high prices they're getting for their cattle right now, and yet some of them are still losing money because they don't grow feed, they have to buy feed, and it's killing them. So there's a lot of uncertainty with regard to whether that policy will sustain. Also, there's international discussion going on. The corn for food versus fuel debate is raging right now. Several of my colleagues actually are doing economic analyses on either side, trying to see what the story is, because essentially a lot of the less developed parts of the world don't grow their own crops, or if they do, they don't grow them in sufficient amounts. So they literally have to import things like corn and wheat and so on into their economy. Well, they don't have much money, and so when suddenly the price of this imported grain that they use doubles and triples, they can't buy the same amount. They have a fixed budget, so to speak, and so there's a lot of arguments at the international level that food should be the primary target market for, well, let's say food commodities or grain commodities. They want them out of the fuel category into the food category to push prices down at the international level. So that basically policy is one of the big sources of uncertainty in the market. But right now it's driving some of the markets. My next slide is going to show you this one, foreign exchange. So let me focus on this one right here next. I'm part of the, quote, baby boom generation, which means I'm so old that I've actually got some savings, because someday, pretty soon, I'm going to have to retire, whether I need to or not. My wife will insist on it. Well, my whole generation has been trying to save money for the last 10 or 20 years. And so what happens when an economy like the US, people start saving money? Well, what do you do with it? You don't just put the money under a mattress. You try to invest it to generate some sufficient return, some growth, and so on. And so what has been happening over the last couple of decades is not just the rate of savings, because the baby boomers were a large chunk of the population, but the total amount of savings has just taken off. Now, where do those savings go? In most cases, it's invested in pension funds and other types of retirement. Hedge funds, index funds, all these other things. Essentially, all these are different names for the same kind of thing. It's people that manage your money. And so think of yourself, if you made your living taking money from other people and then trying to figure out how to make that money grow. Well, there's not a lot of alternatives when you're talking about trillions of dollars. It's not like you can kind of stick that in the lemonade stand. You need to invest very large amounts of money. Well, the usual places that money was directed was into the stocks and bonds market. Basically, for the first 200 years of American history, that was kind of where people saved money, at least indirectly. In most cases, they put it in their bank, and the bank put it in these other things instead. But essentially, that's where the money went. But in the early part, if we can think back 10 years ago, beyond the current economic crunch, there was another one. In 2002, there was another recession, and it was a bad one. And in 2002, though, a lot of people that made their living managing money, investing money to try to make it grow for clients, they said, you know what? We just noticed something. Stocks and bonds, tend to go up together. They tend to go down together. We need something that moves counter-cyclical. And at least most of the time, not all, but most of the time, a few people like me that happened, although I grew up on a farm, I got degrees in finance and economics, I noticed that commodity markets moved often, not always, opposite to the whole economy. And sure enough, in '02, that's exactly what was happening. In '02, for lots of different reasons, stocks and bonds were crashing. They were beginning the slide that didn't hit bottom until about '08. And so people were looking for alternatives. They were pulling money out of the stock market and they were investing it in commodities because new tools were available to do that. Commodity futures and options markets. Although futures have been around 150 years, not a lot of people without an ag background paid attention. But now all of a sudden people in New York and Chicago and other places realize, hey, well, I shouldn't just say New York and London, Singapore, Tokyo, people all over the globe that had that kind of job were now, because of these tools, these electronic tools like futures markets and so on, could transfer money instantly into whatever market on the globe looked like a better investment than the alternatives. And that part of the story right there cannot be overemphasized. Remember I said it wasn't consumption, it was demand that suddenly changed? This is one of the huge parts of the story. Now we have much more, and I'm talking trillions, not billions, but trillions of dollars are now chasing commodities. Commodity production, yeah, it's going up, but it's going up at a nice stable level because our technology does not enable us to double and triple output in a year. So we're nudging output up enough, hopefully keep ahead of population growth. But demand for our product is now suddenly going crazy. Okay, whoops, well, let me back up. This factor right here, foreign exchange reserves, what are those? Essentially, remember, in global markets, that means your customers now are not just next door, but they're in the next country. When you trade internationally, if you are able to collect more money for what you sell than you use to buy products that you import, the difference, the extra left over, is referred to as foreign exchange reserves if you're talking about the national level. So foreign exchange reserves are essentially the net balance you have available to you to make trades on an international level. And I want to show you what's happened in those markets. This graph starts in 1998, goes to 2008. And the picture actually hasn't changed, it's just that this is the last data I was able to get. But let me show you some numbers here. Over here, the index is in billions of dollars. And let me pick on the biggest player in the market now, China. Notice the red line is China. In 1998, they had about $160 billion in reserves. They now have, well, I shouldn't even say now because this is 4 years ago, but 4 years ago, they had 10 times that. $1.5 trillion in cash in their pocket, available to make deals. The blue line is what we call emerging Asia except China. In particular, Southeast Asia, like of all places, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, that part of the world that we've kind of forgotten about since the Vietnam War ended, their economies have been growing. I mean, they were small, they still are small, but they're growing. And in some commodity markets, they're big players, like rice in particular. California, we actually do grow a lot of rice. We know about those markets, believe me. So what's happened there? Well, they're combined. The rest of Asia minus China had a little under 400 billion. They're up to about 1.4 trillion. And what about the old competitors we used to think about? Remember OPEC? I've mentioned the oil embargo of 1973. Well, it was OPEC that suddenly emerged out of obscurity. The oil, petroleum producing countries and so on. They were the villains because all of a sudden they were selling oil and they were taking all of our money. They're small potatoes now. As you can see, they had about 60 or 70 billion. Now they're up to, I think this is about 370 or 80. So yeah, in terms of percentage growth, they've grown, but in terms of absolute weight in the market, you know, they're not big deal anymore. The world has changed. Russia, same thing. Russia has a lot of resources. Russia is resource rich, and essentially that's how they're keeping their economy alive right now. They have a lot of oil, they have a lot of minerals in particular, and that's what they're selling to get the money they need to buy food and other products. Even though they produce a lot of food, they don't produce nearly enough because their yields are terrible because of their climate and so on, and they're really not very efficient in almost any agriculture operation. All right, so the world has changed. What do these changes in the markets mean to U.S. producers, agricultural producers? Well, here's a couple of quick conclusions. First of all, the income risks facing agricultural producers in this country are increasing, meaning that the volatility in agricultural markets is getting worse, which, like, you know, the corn market we were just talking about with regard to ethanol. When it's on the upswing, that's good, but when the downswing comes, you know, that's volatility of an unpleasant sort. Another sort of big conclusion we discovered here is right now, China, which has a landmass of approximately the same area as the lower 48 states of the U.S., we have 0.3 billion people. They have 1.3 billion people, same area, 4 times the population, same space. So yes, they need to develop their agricultural sector because that's where the population mostly still is. They have hundreds of millions of people still in agriculture, literally planting and harvesting by hand. But economic development requires that process, you know, of moving people from the farm into the cities. You got to have jobs first in the cities. That's why they're doing now, in the last 20 years, what Japan did after World War II. Since their industries were blown apart by the war, they looked at their resource base. Well, in Japan, they had virtually no land. That's an area about the size of California, and it's all mountainous, so they couldn't grow their food if they wanted to. So what they did have was a large population base with skills. They built brand new manufacturing industries and started importing the inputs, turning them into things of some value, and then exporting it. That's exactly what China's doing now. They have a huge labor base, and they're improving their skill level unbelievably. At Virginia Tech, same as at UC Davis, I get more applications for graduate school from China than I do from the rest of the world combined. They are flooding, and it's almost all government subsidized students. The government is giving scholarships to their students to go, since they don't have room for them in their own universities, and they're building a lot of universities, but they're sending their students all over the world to get the skills to bring back home, not just in agriculture, but in everything. And so right now, when they're still in this development stage with regard to agriculture, they are a competitor of American agriculture. They produce a lot of the same products that we do, especially because I'm from California. I can tell we pay a lot of attention to the Pacific Rim in California. And China is a big competitor in almost every market. But in about 10, and this depends on which economist you talk to, but in about 10 to 20 years, the reverse will be true. They are going to go from a net exporter to a net importer. 20 years ago, they were a net importer. They were buying our wheat. Now they're competing with us. 20 years from now, they'll be buying our wheat again. And how are U.S. producers responding to all these changes? When you look at the structure of American agriculture, one of the things we've seen is the average size of operations has gotten bigger every single year since our depression of the 1930s. The average size of farms is getting bigger, which means there's fewer of them. Because when you have a fixed land mass, cut it into pieces, you have to have fewer pieces if each piece is getting bigger on average. And I can tell you, we've had about 300 million acres, harvested acres, in this country since 1900. It's been almost flat. Now, total land in agriculture goes up and down because of pasture land and grazing land and all the other stuff in the mountains that we sometimes count, sometimes not. America's portfolio of agricultural enterprises is diversifying. More and more people are growing more and more crops. And we're dealing with risk using all sorts of specific risk management strategies like forward contracting and others. Here's just some quick data from 2 different points in time, about 20 years ago and recently, once again using data from the ag census that the USDA does, just to show you some fruit and vegetable crops. And remember earlier on I pointed out that they're kind of the tip of the spear, so that's why I'm coming back to them. But showing that in a 20-year, oh no, sorry I hit the wrong button, back up 2 please. My fingers are just bigger than these, but there we go. That in just 20 years, what we're showing here is the average size, or what we call the median. If you lined up the smallest asparagus grower and the biggest asparagus grower, and you pick the one right in the middle, how big is that one? And then doing the same thing 20 years later, you can see that on average, operations have, in many cases, have doubled in size, which means a lot of operations no longer exist, because only 1 out of 2 people can now be farming if you have twice the size. And so the conclusion that we can draw from some of this, notice I'm using different terms. Got to watch my fingers here. Agricultural markets. Ag markets, as you can see, are highly responsive to supply and demand, which means prices for ag commodities will always be volatile. The range, you know, where the average price is, may go up and down over time, like corn. Right now, the average price is up here, but it's still pretty volatile. Commodity markets, now, this is all commodities, not just ag, as you can see, have seen these huge expansions in demand because mostly this issue about a whole bunch of money chasing a fixed supply of products. That is going to, this part here is going to continue at least for another 10 or 15 years until all the baby boomers basically are replaced as customers by the next generation. And this final point I want to make out, I'm specifically now pointing to one sector of the ag market, the vegetable market, fruits and vegetables really. It's that highest category, the high revenue products. That sector, very much like livestock markets, are really good indicators of the health, the economic health of consumers. When people have more money, they're more likely to spend more of it on higher value crops, like fruits and vegetables, and higher value components to their diet, like protein from animals. So if you want to kind of get a short-run perspective of what's going on in the markets, this sector, as you can see, we see basically for at least another 10 years. Although right now, some people may argue with me, but believe it or not, the average economic circumstance for people in this country is getting better. It's recovering from a few years ago when the market tanked, but it's recovering now, and so demand for high-value food products like pork, poultry, and vegetable crops is going up. The markets are good, and one of the things that makes this probably pretty good for the foreseeable future, like the next 30 to 50 years, is if you look around the globe, because we're now talking about a global context, if you literally, as we as economists must now do, look at the globe as a single unit of resources. Nothing comes into this system other than sunlight, occasionally an asteroid. So in other words, we have a fixed bundle of resources. how did you allocate that to maximize the productivity? If you were in charge of the world and your job was to make sure, that all these people we have get not only food to eat, but food that they want to eat, what you see is there's only certain parts literally on the globe where some commodities grow well and others not. And so essentially, if we could get rid of the political borders, food production would shift in some cases. In other words, some places like, well, let's just say desert climates, they don't really grow anything especially well if they don't have water. And even if they do have water, the soil quality may prevent it. So a lot of, for example, northern Africa is never going to be a fruit bowl. But in other parts of the country, of the world, like, for example, the United States, we have a lot of parts of our south and west, or southwest, that are a desert in terms of geographic description because of rainfall and whatnot. But the soil quality enables us to produce products. I mean, certainly if you go to Arizona, I spent about 3 years there. When you first get off the plane, you can't imagine anything's growing there, but then you start seeing the lawns and then a little farther out of town, you start seeing the lettuce and so on. It can grow very well. I spent time in places like Egypt. They're literally carving land out of their desert, and when it gets irrigated, it can produce very well. And so what we're seeing is, our forecast is that these markets, because there's the fewest places on the globe that are really efficient in terms of microclimates for this production, these markets are an indicator of economic growth. And so watch them. And because you're in the livestock markets, you literally are going to be one of the leading indicators that people like me would contact. How's your business doing? If it's doing well because poultry, pork, other producers are doing well, that indicates that the essential ag market is strong. And when I say the essential ag market, I mean considering a global perspective. Not just domestic clients, but international clients are coming to us. And where's the competition? Right now, it's from China. Essentially, no matter what ag market you talk about, China's the first place we look to see what the opposition's going to do. But South America is a slow but steady growing part of the world, in particular Brazil and Argentina both, that can produce lots of different crops and lots of livestock, because they also grow the feed for livestock. And so those are the places you need to pay attention to. Europe is irrelevant. They're a source of demand. They're not a source of supply anymore. Asia, now South America, and eventually Southern Africa is the place where agriculture is going to grow. And I think I've run out of time, so I will stop. Maybe take one question or two. I've run out of time, I think, but go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Blank. Looks like I only have one question. Does anyone else have a question before I? Okay. Oh, another here? Did you? Okay. Could you elaborate on why China will become a net importer in 10 years?
It's essentially the same story I just talked about the whole globe. China, in the 50s and 60s, were having a lot of political turmoil. It wasn't until about the 70s that their government, although communist in nature, it has a remarkable capitalist theme to it, let's just say. And their politics started allowing more capitalistic opportunities, in particular investment. And so more of the globe started investing in China in the 70s, and then during the 80s it really took off. And so what has happened in the last 20 years, since say early 80s until about 2000, was a lot of the wealthier nations, seeing that huge population base, knew, this is the post-World War II Japan all over again. As soon as those people start getting jobs, they're going to want to start buying products. What a great market in a very concentrated area. Related to agriculture, though, their landmass, remember I said it's about the same size as the continental US. And so in that 70s and 80s, they started investing in infrastructure. They started building dams to generate water and electricity and roads, distribution system. I mean, 'cause they just didn't have them before. And so now, and they're still pouring money into infrastructure, but as a result, their ability to harvest, although very inefficient compared to American standards, they're adding to total supply. They are expanding their output. The trouble is, like I said, that they have very limited places they can do that also. Parts of their country in particular, in their west, not so good for agriculture. And their population base, even though it's slowing down its growth rate and eventually is expected to close to stop, they literally have much of their east coast is just not suited. It's what we call fragmented farmland. I mean, there's just not large tracts to facilitate the economies of scale that a modern agriculture requires. Big plots of land are needed often to make cost effective a lot of the big hardware that we use in modern agriculture. And so what's going to happen is their cost per unit now is pretty low because their land and their labor and many of their inputs like water are very low. When you can still hire farm laborers for $1 a day, you can keep your operating costs pretty low, even if you have pretty low yields. But what has happened in the more developed parts of the world like the US, where even though our commodity prices have gone down, our input prices have gone up. Our land and labor and water and other inputs have increased in costs, causing this profit squeeze I was talking about. And so what's going to happen is China will face that same profit squeeze, but it's going to be about 10 to 20 years before the scale of the situation causes their output to slow down in growth to where they won't be self-sufficient in a lot of these products. Hence, they're going to need to go overseas to import.
Okay, and it looks like we have just one more question. What is your view on eliminating the federal farm subsidy program and allowing agriculture to be totally capitalistic?
Almost any economist will tell you that government intervention in commodity markets are inefficient. The problem is it's not economists that pass the laws and whatnot, it's politicians. And politicians operate within political boundaries, you know, certain states and so on. And even my colleagues in places like where my mother grew up in Missouri, Iowa, that part of the world, those places, because they have very few commodities that they can produce effectively, like I said, wheat, corn, soybeans, hogs and cattle, those are primarily their choices. And when the market circumstances in a global sense make them unprofitable, they seek political help, which is basically what happened with ethanol. And so why do governments do that, knowing they're creating an inefficient system by intervening? Well, in the simplest terms, it's on par with creating a minimum wage process. The United States government was not involved in any agricultural markets till the Depression. And what happened when government first got in, had their first farm bill back in the mid-30s, was essentially that agricultural green belt called the Midwest that had very little industrial alternatives to agriculture. They needed the same kind of support that was being created for the urban parts of the country with things like minimum wages and whatnot for workers. And so since you couldn't just say, okay, well now a farmer will make X number of dollars per hour, the way the government chose to try to support those sectors of the economy was through first agricultural prices and then production and so on. Because farmers generated a product, if you gave them something to do, they were generating products that were generating food. And so the government's logic was, okay, we're artificially raising prices, but that's stimulating more agricultural output, which is lowering the price of food ultimately to consumers across the whole country. And so the idea was that kind of a transfer, presumably that it was justifiable because there were many people benefiting in the sense they had a better volume and better quality of diet. But like I said, politics, economists like me try to avoid because political arguments never end. Yeah.
So, further that just a little bit though, it's obvious that we've gone too far with ethanol from many people's point of view. So do you see any of that changing in the short term? I mean, you referenced the fact there's a lot of discussion about it.
You mean, I want to make sure, you're talking about government involvement in ag markets?
No, I'm really talking about the government's mandating the percentage of ethanol in fuel, therefore it's having an impact on the price of corn.
Yeah.
It wouldn't seem like it'd be too difficult to change that mandate a little bit, which actually would allow things to maybe become normalized a little bit more.
Yeah.
Any movement to something like that?
Yeah, there is. In fact, the question for the rest of you who couldn't hear it was asking me about, since I was using the corn for ethanol example earlier as sort of a government involvement in an ag market, do I think that particular example is going to continue, or are we going to see a change in policy? And in particular, with regard to corn markets, yeah, I definitely see that program changing. Well, nothing's happening now, as we all know, because there's an election and nobody wants to change anything until the election. But after the next election, I would expect within a very short period of time that argument's going to be brought to a head because, for example, if you want to make ethanol, corn is not the best product to use. Other types of biomass is a more cost-effective and fuel-efficient. One study I saw showed that it literally takes more energy to produce ethanol out of corn than the energy coming from that ethanol contains. So it's a stupid policy, but it's an economic policy involving trying to essentially maintain some level of economic support for a sector of the economy that was suffering. But that's the kind of problems you have when you're talking about policy in agriculture, is that there's the production side and then there's the consumption side. Consumers are all of us. Production sides are very small groups that often don't have much power, but in election years that power increases. And so I'm not sure if I've completely answered your question, but in general, I do anticipate that government periodically will be drawn into very market-specific policies, but in general, the move toward free trade, free markets, which means get the government out, which is what most farmers want, is what's going to happen. And I pointed out, as an example, 30 years ago, I spent 2 years in Australia working for their equivalent of our USDA. And at that time, I happened to be in charge of running their dairy marketing and outlook section. And they had one of the weirdest dairy policies you ever saw. It was bizarre and highly inefficient, but it came out of the weird shortages that had occurred during World War II, and they'd overreacted and so on. But during the 2-year period that I was in Australia, they were discussing whether or not to get the government completely out of their dairy industry. And dairy, not only in Australia, but the United States and most places, is one of the most regulated ag commodity markets there is. And in Australia, they decided, after a lot of screaming, to do it. The government got out. The dairy industry shrunk, but what's left was all much more efficient and profitable. It also moved. There weren't dairy herds in Queensland anymore. There were more down in Victoria in the south, so on. So that's generally what is going to happen, because eventually there is an economic rationale to what happens. It just takes a while for all the politics to get sorted out.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Blank.
Thank you,
Back
everyone.
over to Mike.